The scan lights up in the prefrontal cortex, but the damage was done years before the first MRI was ever taken. You're looking at the brain of a man who killed 3 people, and the neural signature doesn't show a monster. It shows a lesion, a hardware failure that happened when he was 8 years old and nobody noticed. This is the moment the forensic neurology of violence stops being theory and becomes a map of exactly what we keep missing. If you've ever read a crime headline and felt the justice system just doesn't make sense, you know that uneasy feeling of randomness, like there's no logic to who becomes violent and who doesn't. The evidence suggests there is a logic, but it's not about evil. It's about a circuit that broke, and the break happened in a specific year of childhood, in a specific region of the brain, under a specific kind of pressure that most of us would never recognize as dangerous. By 2009, a team at the University of New Mexico had already scanned the brains of over 80 convicted killers. They weren't looking for evil. They were looking for patterns in gray matter density, and they found one that changed how we read every case that followed. 80% of these scans showed reduced activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and social decision-making. But the more important finding was the date of injury. Most of the damage had occurred before the age of 10. This is where the loop opens, and you have to hold 2 facts in your mind at once. The first is that the human prefrontal cortex undergoes its most sensitive developmental window between the ages of 4 and 9. The second is that during those same years, a child who experiences a specific type of head trauma can lose the capacity to regulate aggression permanently. The scans don't lie about that. The question is why nobody scans for this in the courtroom. Now consider the numbers from a 2015 meta-analysis published in the Journal of Neuropsychiatry. Across 23 studies and over 3,000 participants, individuals who had sustained a traumatic brain injury before age 10 were 2.6 times more likely to engage in violent criminal behavior in adulthood. 2.6 times. That's not a correlation. That's a predictive signal strong enough to be called a risk factor. It's almost never mentioned in a sentencing hearing. Remember that broken circuit from the opening scan. This is where it started. The orbitofrontal cortex does not scream when it's hurt. A child who takes a fall, gets hit by a ball, or is in a car accident can sustain a contusion that never causes a visible symptom. No seizure, no speech loss, no paralysis. Just a quiet change in how the brain processes threat and reward. By the time that child reaches adolescence, the wiring has already stabilized around a new set point, one where aggression feels normal and consequences feel irrelevant. This is the part most people miss. The neurological evidence does not excuse violence. It explains why the standard tools of punishment often fail. When you incarcerate a person whose orbitofrontal cortex cannot properly evaluate the future cost of an action, you are essentially asking a blind person to read a sign. The brain cannot access the very data the justice system assumes it can. Wait, let's look at what the scan evidence actually says about the difference between a killer who was born with antisocial wiring and one who acquired injury. The structural differences are visible on a T1 weighted MRI. Genetic psychopathy shows a specific pattern of reduced volume in the amygdala and the anterior insula. Acquired sociopathy from childhood trauma shows thinning in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a different region entirely. These are not the same brain. The system treats them the same, but the circuits are different colors on the scan. In 2012, a research team led by Dr. Adrian Rain scanned the brains of 41 individuals who had been convicted of murder or manslaughter. They found that the group who had suffered early childhood head trauma had significantly lower heart rates at rest and significantly higher cortisol levels during stress. The autonomic nervous system was dysregulated, and that dysregulation was measurable at age 6. The prediction window existed decades before the crime was ever committed. Here's what the evidence shows about the financial side of this oversight. Each undiagnosed childhood TBI that later results in violent crime costs the public an average of $1.4 million in incarceration, legal fees, and victim costs. That's per case. And the rate of undiagnosed TBI in juvenile detention populations is estimated at 46%. Nearly half of the young people in the system have a brain injury that no one ever screened for, and the injury correlates directly with the behavior that put them there. Now consider what happens when you apply this data to the family of a child who has had a concussion. The parents are told to watch for dizziness and blurred vision, but nobody tells them to watch for a change in emotional control 6 months later. The window closes, the lesion heals structurally but not functionally. And by the time the behavior becomes criminal, the original injury has been forgotten by everyone except the scan. This is the moment where the core loop closes. The circuit wasn't broken by evil, it was broken by physics, a collision, a decade of silence, and a system that refuses to look at the wiring. The title promised a shocking answer about who profits when this injury remains undiagnosed. The answer is the prison industry, the legal system that charges adults for damage done at age 8, and the pharmaceutical companies that treat symptoms without ever imaging the source. You now know more about what actually drives a killer's brain than 90% of the people who sit on juries. That isn't arrogance, it's data. The orbitofrontal cortex is the part of the brain that stops you from hitting someone in a moment of anger. When it's damaged before age 10, the brake is gone. And the system keeps blaming the driver for a car that was delivered without brakes. The question is whether we will ever screen for the damage before the crash. Here's the problem with that question. It assumes the medical infrastructure is ready to test every child who falls off a bike. And that's not how triage works. A simple functional MRI of the orbitofrontal cortex costs around $2,000 per scan, and most public hospitals will not order one unless there is already a visible lesion on a structural image. The silent damage, the kind that changes behavior without changing anatomy on a standard radiologist's read, is invisible to the only test most families can afford. That is the real profit center. When a test exists but is never administered, the downstream costs get socialized across courts, prisons, and victim compensation funds. Meanwhile, the private imaging companies have no incentive to push for universal screening because there is no blockbuster drug that treats a deadened orbitofrontal cortex. The only intervention is early detection and behavioral coaching, which carries no patent and no monopoly. If you have ever sat through a trial and felt that something about the defendant's history did not add up, you were probably right. The mismatch between a violent act and a normal-looking childhood is often the only clue that a neurological event was missed. But the standard legal framework has no category for invisible brain damage. The law recognizes insanity, diminished capacity, and intent. It does not recognize a lesion that happened 20 years ago and was never documented. Some European jurisdictions have started to change this. In Sweden, a 2018 pilot program in the Stockholm region began offering free MRI screenings to any juvenile offender under 16 who had a documented head trauma before age 10. The results were striking. 42% of the scanned group showed cortical thinning in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the exact same pattern Dr. Rain identified in his 2012 cohort. Those young people were not treated as criminals, they were treated as patients with a preventable behavioral consequence of a physical injury. The cost of that Swedish program was less than $300,000. The projected savings in reduced reoffending over 5 years are estimated at $4 million. That is the number that changes the argument from ethics to economics. Early neurological screening is cheaper than incarceration, and it prevents the violence before it happens. But it requires admitting that the brain is not a moral choice. The last time you read a headline about a mass shooting or an unprovoked assault, you probably searched for a motive, jealousy, grievance, ideology. The scan suggests that a significant percentage of those events share a simpler, less satisfying driver. A quiet injury during childhood that removed the neural brake, combined with an environment that never screened for it, and a society that mistakes the symptom for the cause. Forensic evidence now exists. The maps are drawn, the circuits are labeled. The only missing variable is the decision to look at them before the body count rises. This scan does not explain one killer. It predicts the next one and the one after that. We have known for a decade what to look for, but we keep pretending it is a moral choice rather than a neurological lesion. The scan does not moralize. It just shows you exactly where the circuit stopped working, and it waits for you to decide what to do with that information. And that decision is the only thing standing between a system that punishes damage and a system that prevents it. The orbitofrontal cortex, the amygdala, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, these are not abstract labels on a textbook diagram. They are the hardware of every decision you have ever made, every impulse you ever stopped, every time you chose to walk away instead of strike. When that hardware is damaged before the age of 10, the choice is never truly a choice. It is a reflex running on broken circuitry, and the justice system calls it evil because it has no category for a circuit. The scan does not care about your opinion. It does not care about the law. It only records the voltage, the density, the timing of the injury. And what it has recorded across thousands of brains is a pattern so consistent that ignoring it is no longer ignorance. It is a choice made by every prosecutor who never ordered a scan, every judge who never asked for a neurological history, and every policy that funds punishment but not prediction. You are now inside the evidence. You know what the scan shows when the damage happens and why the system looks away. The only question left is what you do the next time you read a headline that makes no sense. The scan already knows the answer. The question is whether we will ever have the courage to look at it before the crime.